myself. My name is Anuraj Shah. I'm a fellow at the American Constitution Society.
And I'm Diane Johnson. I'm a judge on the Arizona Court of Appeals.
And my name is Liza Prendergast. I work for an organization called Democracy International, and I participated in Native People many years ago.
Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
My name is Kayla Swiderski. I'm a senior, and I'll be majoring in political science.
My name is Ival Hanneman. I'm a senior as well, and I'll also be majoring in political science.
My name is Taylor Mongolay, and I'm a senior, and I will be majoring in political science. And this is our wonderful teacher, Mrs. Spring, Colleen Spring.
Great intellectual diversity on this channel. I'm just messing around. Your question today is question number 1. The state constitution developed in Pennsylvania in 1776 was considered the most democratic of the state constitutions, and it provoked considerable controversy. Working for 8 weeks, the Constitution drafters considered and then rejected 3 of the most honored elements of English Republican thought. What elements did they reject when writing the Pennsylvania Constitution, and what were the reasons for doing so? What are the advantages and disadvantages of a unicameral legislature? Which do you prefer, and on which fundamental democratic values and principles or other interests is your opinion based? What impact, if any, did the Pennsylvania Constitution have on the U.S. Constitution? You want to read it?
The Democratic Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776 was considered radical for its time as it rejected the formation of a bicameral legislature, property requirements for voters, and an independent executive branch. It established a unicameral legislature in which officials were elected to 1-year terms as opposed to a 2-house system like the one that existed in Britain. The Pennsylvania framers argued that upper houses often represented aristocratic interests of the wealthy, which did not reflect the majority of the common people, and the other unicameral bodies, including nearly a century of unicameral rule in Pennsylvania, had sufficiently governed in the past.
Property requirements for voters were also eliminated. Citizens who paid taxes and were willing to fight in the Revolutionary War were recognized as contributing members of society deserving the right to vote. This expanded suffrage allowed the legislature to be checked from below with more democracy rather than from above with less. A single executive was associated with tyrannical British rule and was not considered representative of the people. The Pennsylvania Constitution created a 12-member executive council led by an appointed president. Its sole function was to implement laws, and lacking essential checks, such as the power to veto bills, it quickly became dominated by the legislature.
The Pennsylvania Constitution was amended in 1790 to include a bicameral legislature, and currently Nebraska is the only state with a unicameral legislature. Unicameral legislators can simplify bill passage as they only need to pass through 1 house. This also makes legislators more accountable to their constituents, as bill making is more transparent. Unicameral legislators limit the power of committees, which in several states, like Kansas and Hawaii, have utilized the gut and stuff strategy in which legislators remove the text of a measure and replace it with different language, often changing the nature of the bill. Unicameral legislators, though, may lack the more thorough deliberation and internal checks that come with a 2-house legislature.
In describing the Senate in Federalist 62, Madison states that no law or resolution can now be passed without the concurrence first of a majority of the people and then of a majority of the states. On a national level, the 2-house system can represent both majority and minority perspectives and provide more internal checks. Although the system is less democratic, we support a bicameral legislature on the national level. The current bicameral legislature embraces popular sovereignty, checks and balances, majority rule, and minority rights. On a state level, though, the cost, transparency, and efficiency of state legislatures have made the existence of the bicameral legislature debatable, especially because, as a result of Reynolds v. Sims, legislative districts must be equal across populations.
Elements of the Pennsylvania Constitution were utilized as deterrent examples during the 1787 Constitutional Convention. Although their system of government was flawed, Pennsylvania's Republicans, who were unable to alter their state constitution, mobilized its opponents to address problems at the national level. Framers like James Wilson and Governor Morris of Pennsylvania, along with James Madison and Edmund Randolph, contested provisions like the unicameral legislature, plural executive, frequent rotation in office, and lack of executive vetoes, sometimes directly referencing the government of Pennsylvania.
A bicameral legislature, established in Article in Section 1, prevents the branch from sucking power into a legislative vortex. The independent executive, whose powers are defined in Article 2, Section 2 to 3, can veto congressional bills, appoint officials, and serve as commander-in-chief. Although some view the Pennsylvania Constitution as a failure, it is important to acknowledge that the radical elements of the Pennsylvania Constitution reflected a democratic zeitgeist popular amongst many citizens during the Revolutionary period. After a period of British deprivation of proper representation and individual rights, it seems natural that the colonists would desire a form of government more in line with the will of the people. Acting as a laboratory of democracy, Pennsylvania demonstrated the vicissitudes of democratic institutions and was an essential caveat in framing of our national constitution.
Great. One of the aspects of the Pennsylvania State Constitution was a council of censors, which would come together after a certain period of years to figure out or to recommend changes to the Constitution or to any of the laws passed by the legislature. I was wondering if you would favor a similar council of censors on the at the national level to kind of take stock of where we're at after a certain amount of years.
I think in the sense the court has kind of taken responsibility for that in the aspect of at least looking at laws and determining their constitutionality. So we had the concept of judicial review, which was, it had precedent before, but it was established in Marbury v. Madison, and they have the responsibility to kind of look at the Constitution and determine this law is in line with it or is it not.
And I think in addition to that, the judicial branch acts as the final arbiter of the Constitution, which is what our nation is founded upon. And so if we allow, we have the legislative branch is supposed to adhere to it, but a check on that would be the Supreme Court, which would serve as, is it working later on?
In your opening presentation, you expressed a clear preference for the bicameral legislature at the national level. But do you think that we've actually gone the other way from a legislative vortex, that Congress is so inefficient that it actually can't do the job that it's supposed to do, that the framers had intended for it to do, and having a unicameral legislature would solve that problem?
Well, I think one aspect that's really kind of enhanced the problem with having a bicameral legislature is the rise of partisanship. So we've become so polarized, and recently with our government shutdown, it was the longest government shutdown in history, it wasn't even necessarily the problem, didn't necessarily come from the two houses entirely, but it was also because we had a Republican-dominated Senate and a Democratic House of Representatives, and that partisanship has caused so much tension, and we've become so polarized that it's been difficult for us to come to a consensus on issues.
Well, also on the national level, we also wanted to reiterate that having bicameralism and having different means of selecting representatives in the Senate, it's equal representation, in the House it's proportional. It does help small states like ourselves get the benefits that we need. Yeah.
You addressed in your opening statement the concept of an excess of democracy that some thought were present in the Pennsylvania Assembly. We're kind of thinking about that further. What do you think about imposing term limits on the United States House of Representatives?
I think that there are two sides to that argument. I think on one hand, a term limit could hinder the effect, or sorry, not hinder, it could promote, it would allow, because the legislative branch of the House, a lot of it depends on seniority, so the committee chairmen are typically the most senior, and so that, the committee chairman in itself, it is a minority. Committees are smaller, they're selected by the majority party, and so that would be a hindrance. That promoting term limits would be, on congressmen, could mean that the seniority of that could stop, which in turn, with seniority, it comes experience, I think.
And then on the other hand, frequent rotation in office may seem like a good plan, especially given the amount of gridlock that we've had recently. So it could be seen as a method of, by cycling out new representatives and giving more people a chance to represent themselves in our government, it may be seen as a way to maybe promote progress and try and promote change in a time when sometimes we become very gridlocked.
And it's also, rotation in office is also used to help kind of reflect the representation of the country as a whole, the diversity of the people. So Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez kind of reflects more of a more participation of younger peoples, and there's a lot more women in the House of Representatives as well as diversity.
One of the problems the Pennsylvania framers of the Pennsylvania State Constitution had with an upper house was that it would they saw it as routinely dominated by wealthy or elite interests, and I found it odd that you guys liked bicameralism specifically for our system when most members of the United States Senate today are wealthy, most of them are millionaires, and are frequently funded by special interests. How do you square those two? Or are we still falling prey to what the Pennsylvania State Constitution framers want?
Well, I think one important part is looking back at kind of what the Senate was intended for. So in Federalist 64, they're talking about the formation of the Senate, and it discusses how the House of Representatives is supposed to represent a majority of the people, and the Senate represents the states. So by having laws that will pass through both houses, it can appeal to a greater majority of people. So in the sense that if both houses were proportional, or if we only had one house, we would be missing out on a lot of that extra deliberation that comes with having a bicameral legislature, and also potentially overshadowing smaller states that might not have that same voice in the proportional system.
And appropriations bills have to originate in the House, and so those kind of bills will be more likely to reflect the visions of the people, since it's more proportional. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I really, there were some, I thought fundamentally you guys did a great job with prepared response. I just want to highlight a few. Did not expect to hear the gun stuff. I guess procedures, to be honest, I don't really know much about it. It was very interesting. The fact that you guys had a very nuanced position with regards to the first bullet point, and staking out a position that you liked bicameralism on the national level, but the benefits were debatable on the state level. I don't think we've heard that. And specifically when you talked about the reasoning behind Reynolds versus Sims and how everything needs to be equal, that made complete sense to me, and it was very easy to follow your train of thought. So I love that. And then I think I said this yesterday, where buzzwords are not necessarily the end all be all in this competition, but they certainly help. The fact that you guys pointed to Governor Morris and James Wilson and their role in the convention just shows a lot of reading that you presumably did, and I was very happy to see that you understood their role in the convention and how they brought their fear of the Pennsylvania State Constitution to our national convention. The response to the Council of Censors and how the court has basically become that, fantastic. I completely agree with you. No notes on that. And then the response to term limits on U.S. House Representatives talking about seniority, I also thought was really wonderful. So great job, guys.
Yeah, I also really enjoyed the presentation. I echo what my colleague said about your opening testimony. I thought it really responded to the questions that were asked in a very nuanced way. But my favorite part was definitely the follow-up conversation that we had. I liked that you rejected the premise of my question and said, no, it's not about the bicameral or unicameral issue. It's an issue of partisanship. I thought that was you could have easily gone down the route of the question that I asked, and I think that shows a nuanced level of understanding and a deep understanding that you have of these issues. I also liked that when you were talking about the legislative process, you talked about the committee system. I think that reflects the amount of sort of research and digging that you've done in preparation for all of the questions we probably could have asked around the committee system. But I thought that was interesting because it is a big deal at the national level in terms of changing the power dynamics. You have someone like Senator Byrd, who was a very powerful member of Congress from a relatively small state for a long, long time because of that sort of seniority. So I thought that reflected a really sort of nuanced and deep level of understanding on your part. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, I can see why all of you want to be political scientists. You want to along the way down that road to recognize, although it's not something that is popular right now, but to recognize the value of seniority in the House of Representatives and the Senate. That's a very political science sort of view. I thought your opening statement was wonderful. It was so comprehensive that it left me not much. I had to tick off a few of my questions because you had addressed them. I I particularly like this question, this topic, because it allows you to talk about an excess of democracy, and you turn that into a check on the legislature from below, from the voters, and that's one of the things we've been asking about, and you covered that right off the bat. I also like the fact that you tied the grant of the franchise of voting to the Revolutionary War, kind of an acknowledgement that how can we take the power to vote, how can we not bestow the power to vote on men who risked their lives for this nation. That was very good. Thank you.